Well, joining me now is Robert Palmer, Executive Director at Tax Justice UK. Great to have you on Sky News, Mr. Palmer. Thanks for being with us. Now, Rishi Sunak, let me quote, in fact, what I just said. Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson have overseen the largest tax rises since the Second World War. When you put it like that, it doesn't sound very conservative, does it? How do you explain how we've got to that point?
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting point. As Keir Starmer said in the clip you just showed, we've had fairly anemic growth in this country over the last few years. But on top of that, we've got an ageing population, increasing health costs. You know, there are lots of pressure on our public services, and we can see that all around us. You know, we have schools that are collapsing around children. We have difficulty booking a GP appointment. I mean, I think what feels really obvious to us is that whoever forms the next government over the general election is probably going to have to spend more on public services given the state that they're in. And that means we need to be having a better conversation about who pays our taxes.
Yeah, I want to come on to sort of the solutions and what you would propose moving forward. But it is interesting because the IFS says that this is not a direct consequence of the COVID pandemic. It points to increasing government spending, as you said, the UK's ageing population, again, as you said, pressures on health service, one of your points. But I mean, in a way, that's a little bit disingenuous because actually some of those were pressures driven by the COVID pandemic. Certainly government spending, increased government spending and pressure on the health service were in part a result of the pandemic, weren't they?
Yeah, so the pandemic, we spent a lot of money to support people in jobs and to support people through the pandemic and to support with the rollout of vaccines. You know, all of that money was really well spent because we've come through the pandemic the other side. But it does mean that we do have high levels of debt and that we also have public services that are under real great strain. And I think we can see that. And it is also a consequence of underinvestment in this country for the last 10 years or so. You know, we've had governments stripping back public spending and stripping back investment. And now we're starting to see some of the consequences of that underinvestment. And you can see, you know, there's public pressure to try and do something about public services. And this is one of the things I think is really interesting is ultimately even conservative politicians know that the public want decently functioning NHS, and they'll put more money into public services rather than cut taxes.
I'm interested, actually. Yeah, let's look at sort of the future and how this might be solved. It's hardly surprising that Keir Starmer has taken aim at the government on this, but quite interesting his wording. He said his focus has been on the dismal failure of the government on growth, his emphasis on growth. Does that sound very Labour? To me, it sounds as though neither party is particularly conforming to what you might expect. I would have imagined he might have focused on perhaps tax redistribution, perhaps not changing the level of tax that the government takes in, but perhaps who is taxed the most. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think Keir Starmer is right. And, you know, we saw this also from someone on the other end of the political spectrum, Liz Truss, that economic growth would help solve lots of our problems. It would mean we'd have a bigger pie. It would mean the government would have more tax revenues, there'd be more money to go around. But there's lots of things that we need to do to kickstart growth, including investment, to make sure that people are healthy and can go to work, that we have a public transport system that works. And so it's going to take time.
But where does that investment come from?
So I think in the short to medium term, it is going to have to come from the government. And that's why I think as we go into the general election, we're going to see both political parties almost tell a slight falsehood that they're going to get away without having to increase public spending. And I think that's going to be really difficult. I mean, one of the things I think...
Is there a world in which they could keep the public spending the same or even increase it? They could keep the levels of taxation that they take in the same, but just focus on different groups, that they would collect that taxes from, for example, the top 1% of wealth in the country.
I mean, that's a very good point. We have a tax system that is really skewed towards taxing income from work. And, you know, that's just one reason why when Rishi Sunak published his tax affairs, it showed that his average tax rate was lower than that of a nurse, was because he gets lots of his income and pays tax on wealth. And so one of the things that we would like to see is increasing taxes on wealth. We're a very wealthy country. There's lots of wealthy people out there who could be paying more tax on their wealth, and then use that money to invest in the sort of high quality public services that all of us want to see. And I think the idea that, we're currently having a debate about potentially cutting inheritance tax, and that seems like the really wrong priority for the government to potentially do when we're in a cost of living crisis and when public services are in such a bad state.
Yeah, so actually your point about honest conversations about what is needed is interesting, because that is what the Prime Minister keeps saying that he is doing, is having grown-up conversations about the trade-offs he's making. But your point that they're not honest enough. I wonder, when we look at the UK within the context of international taxation, it's kind of in the middle of the pack when we compare it to the taxation level collected from other countries. With that in mind, actually, is there cause for concern, or should we just think, well, we're sort of on par with the rest of the world here? This is a global phenomenon.
It is a global phenomenon in terms of ageing populations and pressure on health costs and other costs. But you're absolutely right that when it comes to the tax, the UK tax rate is very much in the middle of the pack compared to other rich countries. And if you look at European countries, they have much higher rates of tax. And I think it's quite likely that as we go into the future, governments will end up spending more money on public services, and that might have to include tax rises, because I think the political pressure to stop the NHS falling over will be so huge. But I think we should have a debate about who we're taxing. At the moment, most of our tax comes from people who are working and from people who are buying things. If you have wealth, or you're one of the super rich, or you have income from wealth, you can pay much lower rates of tax. And that's definitely something we should be thinking about fixing.
Yeah, let's hope we get a clearer idea over the coming weeks of what the political parties will be, or how they will be setting out their stalls on that basis. Robert Palmer, Executive Director at Tax Justice UK, thanks very much.